When you are in the silence, your own thoughts and your own inner voice becomes amplified. The reality is that a lot of us might actually be very unkind with ourselves. We don't like hearing unkind things from others, right? But what more if it's ourselves? Because I think it places us in a very helpless situation when we come face to face with the realities of who we think we are. You're not very aware of what's going on within you. Having to face the reality, because when you come to the conclusion and you hear your inner voice or your inner thoughts come to light, what are you going to do about it?
Hi everybody, welcome to the Human Exchange, or THX for short, a platform where I like to discuss all things performance, potential, and purpose in a real, raw, and relevant way in both our professional and personal lives. At the Human Exchange, I am very interested to not just engage with experts, but also humans. And right in front of me today, I've got a human that I've known for a while now. Her name's Emily. She's currently a practicing clinical psychologist in Singapore. Emily, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Privileged to be here.
Emily, before we begin, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and yeah.
Okay, so as you mentioned, I am a practicing clinical psychologist in a public health institute in Singapore, but I did all my training here in Malaysia. And so I've worked both in the private setting and in a public setting in Malaysia. So I was based in a psychiatric ward during my training times. Right now, the kind of population that I work with is mostly adults and ranging from 21 all the way till, I think my oldest patient now is 96.
Wow.
Yeah, so really you're talking about humans. Yep, I meet them every single day of my life. Yeah, so that's what I do on a daily basis.
Yeah, and maybe to give a bit of context to everybody as well, one of the reasons why I invited Emily to share with us today is I'm interested to find out about or discuss themes centered around mental wellness, mental resilience, and also some of the mental health challenges that many high-performing people might experience. And when I talk about high-performing, I don't necessarily mean high achievers. I mean people who, you got a lot of responsibilities, you got work, you've got family, and all these different things, right? So I thought it'd be interesting and worthwhile to be talking about. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you this question. Clinical psychologist, how does that differ from I don't know whether it's okay to say regular psychologist and a counselor? What are some of the differences?
Maybe to add on to that, I'll add in psychiatrist to the mix as well, yeah. Because people always ask this question. If I get, $1 every time someone asks me that question, I'll be rich by now. But anyway, so I'll start with psychiatrists first. So psychiatrists, they are medical doctors by training. So they specialize in the field of psychiatry. So they are the ones that can prescribe the medication. And they are the ones that do treatment that involves more of like the medical aspect of things. So there are certain types of mental health disorders that require more pharmacological intervention. So either it be mainly medication, and there are also the kind therapies like you might have heard of ECT, right? So that's electroconvulsive therapy, where it's very medical based, right? And usually, at least in a hospital setting, what the psychiatrist would do is they would then refer to a clinical psychologist if the hospital has that service, and then we are the one that does the talk therapy. Okay, so now the distinction between a clinical psychologist and a counselor is that usually a clinical psychologist is the one that deals with people with diagnosed mental health disorders or conditions, right? So as clinical psychologists, we are also trained to diagnose, and we are also trained to assess. So we can do neuropsychological testing, developmental testing, and things like that, right? So we use quite specific forms and modality of therapies to treat our patients Whereas with counselors, they usually they will focus more on general life stresses. It means that they might not necessarily have a mental health condition, but they are also very much trained to manage things like stress, to a certain degree, depression and anxiety. So that's where they will talk through your life and help you process through the different things. So I would say the main distinction, psychiatrists, they're the ones that give you the medication. Clinical psychologists, we can assess you, we can diagnose you, and we can treat you with other forms of talk therapies. Counselors, they don't do so much of the diagnosis, they do more of the processing and counseling work.
So it's like a level of escalation. Then you start with a counselor. If this fella cannot solve your problem, okay, go see the clinical psych. The clinical psych assess you and go, I think you might need a psychiatrist. It's almost sounds like that.
Something like that, but I would say really the things that we deal with might be very different. So as a clinical psychologist, we might not be able to do as much of the family work, right? So counselors would oftentimes do things like family therapy, couples counseling. Of course, as clinical psychologists, we are trained to a certain degree, but I think counselors do that level of work more, at least from my friends who are counselors.
Cool. So you work in a hospital, right?
Yes.
Icebreaking question. What are some of the wildest cases or most challenging cases that you have worked on?
Okay. Well, so confidentiality is definitely a huge thing when it comes to mental health and this profession.
Okay, you can share first, and if we need to, we'll edit it out.
Yes, but because I have worked in so many different places, I'll try to keep this, as private as possible. But I have worked in a psychiatric ward, so you really see everything, right? So I think there was this one particular case where I won't say it's the most intense, but it's generic enough for me to share. Basically, she had a lot of very intense anger issues, and she has what is known as a personality disorder. Okay, and on top of that, in a very, very, very stressful period of her life. So what she did was she would frequently try to strangle people out of anger, and I was seeing her for therapy. Right, so I was really on guard, but and
so that was the only form, or that was a main form of de-stressing. She wanted to strangle somebody.
I don't know if that the main form of de-stressing is the right way to describe it, but the manifestation of anger was by default always strangulation. Yeah, but that's also because this person went through a lot of trauma in her past, and it was reflected in her actions that way as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are way more intense ones, but they're too specific to share. I think it would definitely give it away. Yeah, but that along that lines and beyond, I've seen as well.
Wow. Okay, so you've obviously seen some really wild things in your. How long have you been doing this for? This is long, right?
Including my training, this is my 4th year now. So still quite a baby in the industry, but it's not a very old field compared to, let's say, like medicine, right? But yeah, crazy things have happened. I've had patients come in to my session with knives, with weapons. Yup, always fun. But we're well equipped. We have panic buttons, so on and so forth.
I thought you were going to say that we have bodyguards. We've been sent for jiu-jitsu, kung fu. But okay, you've got a panic button.
I should. Funny story is that my brother tried to train me, to prepare me. One day during dinner, we were sitting at the table and he goes, "Think fast!" And he tried to strangle me just to train me to know how to respond. I completely failed that test. Yeah. Anyway.
You mentioned this is a relatively new field. So that's a good segue into my first question. Is mental health challenges, disorders on the rise in this day and age? Or is it just that we are getting more awareness of it? What are your thoughts?
I think that's a great question. I think even within the field, there's no doubt that there is a rise in prevalence, right? But whether or not it is a matter of awareness versus people actually falling and developing these conditions more, I don't think it's either or, it's both at the same time, right? So naturally, because more people are having it, so more people are talking about it, hence there's more awareness. But I do see globally there is a trend where governments and all these bodies of authorities recognize the importance of it, especially post-pandemic, right? You can see how mental health affects not just family life, but employees' productivity, whether they show up to work, anytime something translates to monetary losses, I think that's when there's a lot of attention that will be brought to it. So there's a lot more studies in showing that, mental health does impact your dollars and cents.
I think it's also important to frame this conversation, or rather assign definitions to terminologies that we'll be using to help people kind of like follow and understand, right? So maybe help us understand a little bit. So we've got mental health, then we've got words like mental illness, disorder. Can you maybe give a bit of insight? How do we properly use these terms when referring to certain things?
Yeah, I can throw in one more, right? Mental health well-being, right? So I think mental health refers to, if we're going to break it down, you have physical health. Some people will throw in emotional health. They will throw in mental health as well. So I think when you use the term mental health, you're referring to it in its broadest form.
It's a blanket statement covering different areas.
Yeah. Correct. So a mental health condition / disorder. Now that one, I think we can use it more interchangeably, but from a clinical perspective, we do use the term mental health disorder, right? Because of how we diagnose, and especially in a hospital setting, for example, let's say when you have to write a diagnosis, it is written as a disorder, okay? A mental health condition, I think sometimes the lines are quite blurred as well, as you say, because, laymen, we use it so often. Mental health condition could suggest that you have certain symptoms, right? Or you look at a person and you go, there might be something on with this person. So you might use the term, this person has a mental health condition, but might not have been formally diagnosed with a disorder, right? And so disorder and illness, I would say, is interchangeable, right? But I do think that the languaging in using disorder is quite intentional, because then you want to educate, and when our patients come for treatment, because something is not in order, hence disorder, we can still learn to manage it. Whereas the illness kind of terminology could make you feel like, it's a disease that I can't really do anything about. Yeah, but again, it's a bit of a potato thing. Yeah, and but at least that's where I stand on, and a lot of maybe my colleagues would agree with me lah.
Are there some general signs that we can see something is at the stage of a disorder? What I mean is that, well, let's take the anger thing, right? Somebody could be naturally predisposed to angry outbursts, when things don't go their way. So, and all of us get angry to some degree. But at what point do we say, hey, your anger is actually a form of disorder? Is there any signs or criteria that we can look for?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great question, because if you start pinpointing all these little symptoms, right, I'm sure every single person you come across can qualify for some sort of mental health condition, right? So it is important, we do have a reference point, which is in the psychology field, the DSM-5. Okay, so we do have a list of criteria. So we never look at one thing in isolation. So, you're a really angry person, and therefore you have what we call intermittent explosive disorder, right? Not so much. It's always a list of criteria. And we look at something that's really important, is how is it affecting your functioning? So your functioning includes, be in your relationships, in your workplace, okay, or whatever setting whereby you need to carry out certain responsibilities. So if these symptoms or whatever you're experiencing is affecting and impacting the way that you live your life, then that will be a red flag lah, or you want to start seeking more professional attention there. Yeah, so there are 3 things that we look at. One is the frequency. How frequently do you get into these anger outbursts? Or let's say if it's anxiety, right? All of us are anxious every now and then. But how frequently does your anxiety stop you from doing something you wish to do or that you have to do, like maybe giving a presentation at work? Okay, so that's frequency. Second is intensity. How intense does it get? Right? Because like you mentioned also, right? Being angry is really normal. But is it in that sense, is it typical? Like, do you start throwing things around, right? So intensity is a little bit difficult to qualify, but that's where our clinical judgment has to come in. We have to ask the right questions to be able to gauge the intensity of it. Yep. And the third thing is duration. So how long does these symptoms prevail for? Yeah. So first, frequency, intensity, and duration. So these are the things I always look out for when my patients tell me or XXX kind of symptoms, so I can monitor them.
Hey everybody, I want to take a break from the conversation we're having to tell you that this episode is actually sponsored by Medicos. Now, I'm not the type that usually wears a mask, nor do I like to, but whenever I need to, I go to no other brand except Medicos. Why? Because it is the most comfortable and it offers up to 3 times more protection than any other mask you will find in the market. On top of that, they've got a great range. They've got my favorite here, Slim. They've got some for the kids, Junior. They also have a hijab range because they have your comfort and practicality in mind. You can find their mask in all major pharmacies, Watson's, Caring, Allpro, as well as the Medicos online store and the e-commerce sites, Lazada and Shopee. Now, back to the episode.
That's very helpful. It's if I were to use anger to kind of like be a example, it's like how often do you get angry? And when you get angry, what are the signs that you display or what actions do you take? So if you are constantly going for somebody's jugular, well, that's a bit intense, isn't it? And the duration, like what's the cooling off period? Same with other things as well. What are some factors that in our modern society that you think are contributing to the rise of mental health challenges or the rise of disorders as well?
That's a really big question. And there's so many ways to answer this, right? And with different groups of people, be it age, even culturally, it might impact that the answer to that question. Okay, but this might sound a little bit technical, but at least this is how I formulate a lot of my cases or a lot of the people that I see to help me, have a glimpse into why is this happening. It's called the biopsychosocial model of understanding certain things. So bio refers to the biology, right? So biology could be the level of activity that you're getting. Okay, like, we know exercise and diet and all these things plays a role. Okay, but more than that, certain mental health disorders do have a genetic predisposition to it, as you alluded earlier. Okay, and things like hormones and all the different things that are happening within your brain, within your body can contribute to that, right? And this is where something that's called a mind-body connection comes in, right? We can talk about that a little bit more later, but so that's all the biology components to it. Right. The second would be the psychology of it. Now, psychology can refer to so many things. Could be your personality, could be your early childhood experiences, could be anything that you're exposed to in your day-to-day, right? So in this day and age, I think what contributes to it is just a sheer amount of things that you can be exposed to, right? Compare this to maybe just even 30 years ago where the internet was still picking up. Right, your access to information, your access to different stressors, right? Debatable whether or not something can be a stressor, but the reality is that you're just exposed to more. Okay, so that's the psychology of it. So all these things will impact your thought processes, how you view yourself, the world, how you view others, and because of the way that you view things, it affects the way that you interact with them. Right, so that's the psychology of it. So the third is the social in the biopsychosocial model. The social of it is anything to do with relationships, environments. Okay, we're talking about high pressure here, right? At work, what are the demands like? What are your, you are wearing many hats, right? The different kind of relationships. Now people are living longer. So it's common to have intergenerational households where, let's say a middle-aged person would have to take care of elderly parents and also young children at the same time. So that's added pressure, right? Previously, maybe again, 30, 40 years ago, maybe my grandparents' time, they have multiple children, right? So you can split the caregiving load between more siblings, for example, of elderly parents. But now, children, the number of children you're getting is less and less. So the amount that you split amongst children will then be naturally mean one person has to take on more. So these are the kind of social and cultural impact that might also contribute to the development of more of these mental health conditions.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I'm reminded of this term that I learned recently, mental load. Because when we talk about physical load, we can see if somebody is carrying a lot because you can literally see it. If I'm carrying very heavy stuff, you are able to pick it up. Hey, you're carrying too many things. But mental load is there, but not so visible because all these things add to our mental load. For example, news that we receive, something that is happening 3, 4, 5,000 kilometers away can also be a load to me because it causes me anxiety, it causes me uncertainty, right? And then, of course, having to deal with the pressures of performing at work and then managing personal relationships. I would then actually surmise that one of the biggest reasons why mental health and illnesses and disorders are on the rise is we're just living in a very different world nowadays. We're not just getting more informed, so the awareness is there, but we are also living in a world that, it's both difficulty and opportunity. I think with the internet, with digitalization and global mobility, there's a lot of opportunity. You can move all over the place, look for new opportunities. But at the same time, you're also, like you said, exposed to all kinds of different pressures. Sometimes some of these pressures are not necessarily directly linked to you, but it's still a load nonetheless. And then you look at it cumulatively, it's tough, isn't it? It's like you're carrying a very, very heavy bag, but every day you've got a little bit of small items added. Eventually, you may not feel it right away, but you feel its effects after a long time. I don't know, what do you think? Like, is my theory spot on?
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, not just I agree with you. I think there's a lot of research that talk about mental load, right? Because we don't think about how, just as that illustration that you gave, you only have 2 hands. There's only so much you can carry. But we think with our minds, it's like, it should be limitless, or at least sometimes we quote unquote feel like it is, right? But the reality is we all have limits. And now that, just as you said, we get exposed to so much more, we can see how much other people are taking more of as well. And it's just easier to do social comparison that way. Whereas, again, 30, 40 years ago, the only thing that maybe people can find out is, aunties on a mahjong table, hey, this one, right? But now it's like, it's just at the tip of your fingers where you can see people parading, unintentionally sometimes, right? What all the good things that's going on in their lives, right? So mental load for sure.
You've got gurus pushing unrealistic and unsustainable routines. Like wake up at 4 a.m., go to the gym, 5 a.m., read the news, 6 a.m., meal prep for the day. So you got like all these things going around, and I think it can cause a certain wrong expectation of how we should be living and leading our lives, and that adds to the mental load as well. I like how you use the illustration of the 2 hands, and all of us have limited capacity, and I think each person's capacity is also different. So these 2 hands are not the same as any other 2 hands, because some people might be stronger, some people might be younger, so they're a bit more agile, durable, that kind of thing. Are there any maybe I'll go with the negative first. Are there any unhealthy patterns that we should ditch in order to keep our mental capacity high? What are some things that we should? So we said one of the things is maybe have the right kind of expectation, understanding that you are limited in person. Any other kind of insights that you can give to make sure that somebody is managing their own mental health and mental capacity in the right way?
I don't really know if there's anything specific that you should be stopping, because again, this can be so many different things for every single person, right? But I think in general, comparison is one of the big ones, right? It goes in line with what you just said, with recognizing that we are humans and it's normal to have a limit, okay? So the thing to stop would definitely be comparing. Why is it that, let's say, okay, so-and-so is the same age as me. This person is already married, has children, has a house, has a car, and why am I not, right? So it's easy to, sometimes it just happens so quickly, so naturally. So I think it's really important to be able to catch yourself whenever you are comparing, right? Then it also comes back down to expectations. But we don't live in a bubble, you see. So as much as you are kind of managing your own expectations, I think it's important to look realistically at what is within your control, right? Because a lot of times when it comes to a lot of these conditions, it's that sense of, I'm so out of control of everything, right? So I feel very dejected. I feel like I should give up, or then the anxiety might kick in, right? Or I might develop some other kind of unhealthy and maladaptive coping strategies that then really turn into like a full-blown condition. So I think it's to be aware. I think awareness is one thing. There's so much talk about mental health awareness, but a lot of times, unfortunately, doesn't translate to much action and much practical change within our lives, right? So I think ditching that need to every waking moment I should be doing something that's useful, right? So, but then again, I think it's difficult to answer that question in a very broad way, because everybody has a different way of living and the kind of expectations that they hold. I think it's easier to answer the question of what we should then be doing, which
please,
I presume will be coming up
Yeah, please
next.
go for it then.
Yeah, I think definitely in our society and in the world now, we do talk about self-care, right? But even self-care becomes a competition, which is so ironic, right? Like, what are you doing? So-and-so is going for Pilates, so-and-so is going for, hot yoga or spin or whatever, right? And then it starts to be a comparison. Is my way of doing self-care, like just taking a nap, less productive than so-and-so who's going for this Pilates class, right? Am I really truly taking care of myself then, right? So I think just having a very, drawing that keeping that space for rest, right, and self-care quite, I don't really know if this is the word to use, but sacred, almost like having a very clear goal of what the purpose of self-care is, right? I think sometimes people also use self-care as a form of escape, right? And they don't really feel rested because whatever is going on in their mind does not really switch off. Yeah, so I think self-care is definitely one of it. Secondly, I think taking stock of your thoughts is really important, right? Sometimes you might not even know that you have all these expectations that are placed upon yourself and the impact that it's having on you. So, I can recommend journaling, but that's not the only way. You can journal, you can voice record to yourself. I don't think that in our society now we pause long enough, because every time there's silence, we fill it in with something, be it listen to a podcast, watching a video, turning on Spotify, whatever it may be, that we're so afraid of being in silence because of what our thoughts might reveal to us. So I think taking a pause and taking stock of our thoughts is really important.
Yeah, I love that. Keeping your being intentional with your self-care. I think if we will go back to one of the earlier points that you made, there is that physical health and mental health. So self-care is both. We have to do things that take care of our bodies. Like for example, if you are tired and you're physically unable to push on, you need to rest, right? There's no sense in pushing yourself more when your body is already at a stage that it needs a lot of recovery. But physical and mental also play a huge part, isn't it? Because I think what you're getting at is that sometimes we find it hard to get meaningful rest because we could be resting our body, but we're not resting our mind. We are still giving that mental load. So this mental load, this terminology, even though it's such a simple term, but it really gave me a lot of clarity because I have found myself in situations where, I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting down, I'm lying in bed and I'm watching TV or I am scrolling through Instagram. But what I'm doing when I'm scrolling through Instagram especially or social media is I'm still consuming information and I'm processing this information. I'm trying to use it to generate my next idea or my next thought. So that's the mental load. So it's really finding a space where we can disconnect both physically but mentally as well. You mentioned that some people are uncomfortable with the silence. They want to add noise, which then contributes to the mental load. Why do you think people are afraid of the silence? What do you think are some underlying factors or driving emotions that can contribute to that fear?
Well, when you are in the silence, it's almost like your own thoughts and your own inner voice becomes amplified, right? And I think the reality is that a lot of us might actually be very unkind with ourselves. We don't like hearing unkind things from others, right? But what more if it's ourselves? Because I think it places us in a very helpless situation when we come face to face with the realities of who we think we are. Okay, now some people are very comfortable and they are very ready to acknowledge that, these thoughts are brewing in my mind all the time. But that's another issue lah. But I'm talking about maybe you're not very aware of what's going on within you. Yeah, so I think it's just that, right? Having to face your reality, because when you come to the conclusion and you hear your inner voice or your inner thoughts come to light, what are you going to do about it? Right? Because you mentioned a lot of times you start playing and maybe like planning for what's coming up next. That still gives you somewhat of a sense of control. Now, whether or not that's true control versus an illusion of control, now that tends to be discussed and processed. But a lot of times it can be very debilitating to feel a certain way and not know what to do about it. So just don't want to think about it.
Yeah, and I think also there is, whether we realize it or not, wider culture does place a lot of value, which translates into pressure on hustling, progress, achieving. So when we are consuming all of this content, we got access to what everybody else is doing, knowledge of what everybody is doing, we can subconsciously create that kind of internal pressure that, hey, we need to be achieving, we need to do this. A lot of high performers that I speak to, they often share this commonality that they feel guilty when they rest. They feel guilty when they are not doing something productive. So it's like if they are with their family, they feel like they need to be, they're not unsettled in that moment because they feel like, what am I doing? I'm just here, right? Or if they go on a beach vacation, you will find them with your laptop open or they're scrolling through their phone, looking through their emails. They find it really, really hard to switch off. So that is, again, like keeping that mental machine running, and the mental load keeps getting larger and larger and larger. Yeah.
I think the question to ask is why? Why do they feel guilty whenever they, try or are trying to take a rest, right? Again, this might be an overgeneralization, but at least from my experience, speaking with a lot of my high-performing clients and patients as well, it's that sense of, but if I don't do this, I don't know what will happen. Like, things might get out of control, right? So it's a sense of security thing. Now, again, this might not be for all, but a lot of times we come back down to this theme of control and wanting to ensure that either they're able to provide for themselves or provide for their families, and that protection, that sense of security that they're trying to build for themselves, right? And wanting to safeguard that. But like we've already mentioned, there's only so much and only so long you can function that way, right? Because if you're adding on so much stress to yourself, naturally that cortisol, right, that hormone gets stored up in your body, and then it translates to different things, which is why we always hear of people getting like stress headaches. Or if you even go to the doctor will ask, you report, oh hey, I've been having a headache, or I've been having more of this pain, so on and so forth. Doctors will always ask, right, have you been more stressed lately, right? And then in a way it kind of like forces you to go into a mandatory state of rest anyway, right? So I think important question to ask is, why do I feel the way that I do? Why do I feel guilty when I'm resting?
Yeah, you use this word a couple of times, control. That's a way we try to manage our stress, isn't it? Where we feel like we're more in control. When things are more certain, then we would have less reason to worry. But the reality is things are getting more and more uncertain. I think that's why our stress levels are getting higher and higher. If you look at world events, I don't know whenever the listeners will be tuning to this episode, but this is the era of the second Trump presidency. He came in with all these kind of tariffs, and they just sent the world markets into tailspin. Right? Everything's going down, up again, and coupled with just global, social, and political and economic uncertainty. I think that's a lot of reasons to be worried worried about. Personally as well, when now that I have 2 kids, before I was just kind of like, hey, let's just do what you believe in, just chase your dreams. But now I'm asking fundamental questions of like, hey, is my dream going to be able to secure my children's future? Have I been dreaming the wrong dream? And then you start getting into thinking, okay, how much money do I need to ensure that they have a good future? How much money do I need to also have for retirement? So yeah, there are just a whole lot of things that you have very good reasons to think about them, but the effects are far from good, right? So the question that I want to ask is that, is there any insight you can give on balancing that? Meaning, yes, there is the need to do things. Like for example, you still need to turn up to your job, you still need to do your responsibilities as a parent, you still need to plan for the future. But at the same time, bearing all of this load, like you can't drop them, or maybe you think you can't, but then you've got this side effect that is kind of like slowly brewing in the undercurrents beneath the surface that may eventually be too much to bear. So any insights on how we can manage that?
That's a big question. I'm figuring that out myself as well. But okay, from really a psychological standpoint, you mentioned this, right? You think you can't. Okay, and I think that thoughts and what you hold on and what you value to, it all comes back down to that. Okay, it's such a paradox of the times that we live in right now, where we have not just access to things, but we genuinely have more resources than probably in any other time in the world, right? But what do these resources really translate to? What do they really mean in your own context of your life and what you hope and value, right? I mean, we always hear this, that money is not everything, but to a certain degree, you need money to survive, right? Yeah, but how much is enough, right? For some people, like, it's never enough. For some people, it's like, there's everybody's reference point and all this is very different, which is why I think you have to come back to your own. I mean, if you are married and if you have a family, bearing them into consideration as well. What are the core values that you have? Because the reality is, while I have access to all these resources, my ability to utilize them is still going to be limited.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So there's this illusion again, like, oh, I need to chase all of this, I need to chase all of this, but you can only hold on to so much, both physically and mentally as well, right? So I think that, with a lot of my patients and clients with, let's say, depression, right? It's not because life was going like bad for them. For some of them, things were going very, very well, but there was this sense of maybe they kind of got lost in the midst of all of that. Then they stop and ask themselves like, hey, what am I really doing all of this for? And then there's maybe some gaps between what they realize, I haven't been fulfilling this part of my life that I actually do value. Therefore, it leads to that sense of emptiness, right? So kind of recalibrating and going back to like really the foundations. What really matters? What matters to you? If you strip away everything, if we're, how would you want to rebuild your life, and what are things that you want to hold on to, right? So there's this therapy, what do you call it? Wow, the word has just disappeared from a modality of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. So a very huge part of this therapy is learning how to accept. People always think that acceptance is like, succumbing to, like giving up, right? But it's such the opposite, where when you come to this acceptance where, okay, I am a limited individual, but I can work within what is my limits. Sure, there are things you can do to gradually expand those limits, but at this very point, what should I accept as my limits? Okay, I can plan ahead for growth, but let me work within what is able first, so that whatever decisions I make can be committed to fulfilling whatever it is that I value in my life.
I feel like I'm going through therapy right now because full disclosure, right? I realized that in the past couple of weeks, maybe even months, I have been going through some form of midlife crisis, and a lot of how I'm resolving this is not fully resolved, but it's a process. But how I'm moving along through this process is around this word of acceptance, because coming from a non-traditional background, I had this drive in me where I go, okay, now I got to make up for lost time. And I not only just to make up for lost time for my sake, but I got to make up for lost time for my family's sake. Got to earn enough, got to do that. But I'm also discovering that I'm not getting any younger. Thinning hairline, diminishing energy levels. I'm like, what's going on? I thought that sometimes I look in the mirror and I go, John, I thought you were this machine. What's going on? You wuss man up, that kind of thing. But I am starting to recognize that, hey, I'm going into a different stage of my life. I'm going stage not just in terms of the things that's happening around me, having family and all that, but also physically, what's happening within me. I have limited energy levels. I need to manage it. But like you said, it's not that you can no longer achieve anything, but it's just how you manage those resources will be very different. It's almost like before you might have had like a giant bank account. You can just burn through all your cash energy-wise. But now you've got this limited amount of energy that only replenishes itself at this stage. So you got to work within that. And that's the biggest part of acceptance. I think that's why there's this thing called midlife crisis, right? Why do men buy sports cars? In my instance, with a motorcycle, have affairs or do crazy things because they're trying to escape from the fact that, hey, you are getting older. But getting older is not necessarily a negative thing or a bad thing. It's how we address that. It's our thoughts, how we see it, and how we look at it. So yeah, I think that's very, very, really important. I've heard this before when it comes to your thoughts, because we talk about managing thoughts. This 3C thing: catch it, check it, and change it. So catch whatever negative thought you're going through, check it, make sure that it's helpful. Even if it's true, if is it helpful, and then change it. Is there a way to reframe it? Because our thoughts so powerful, right? I'm not a psychologist, far from it, but I've also heard this framework, if you like, that's very, very helpful. It says this, like, thoughts affect your emotions, emotions shape your behavior, and behavior reinforces your thoughts. So it's kind of like a loop. So if you want to break that loop, the way to do it is add our thoughts, like change the way you think, check it, and then change it. So yeah.
You're absolutely right. That is like the gold standard of our psychology practice. One of the modalities is called cognitive behavioral therapy, and that is the core foundation of how we understand how to challenge our thoughts, right? So it's a lot about, sure, it might start with your thoughts, right? But sometimes it's not always the easiest to catch. And if you can't catch it, then you can't proceed with checking / challenging. Then you can't move towards the change part, right? So a lot of times being aware of the kind of lens that you are wearing is really important, right? Because if you have all these maladaptive ways of interpreting certain things, then everything that you try, you won't be able to catch it, right? So you got to really check yourself and like ask yourself, what kind of lens am I looking the world at? Right, and the kind of lens that you wear is usually impacted by your early childhood or early life experiences or any significant experiences you've ever faced, right? And significant does not mean big, does not mean major. It could just mean that it left a kind of lasting impact on you. So it could even be that, a parent or a friend made a passing remark like, "Yeah, why so lousy one?" Right? It's so quick, but it was significant to you because it left a lasting impact, right? And that kind of shapes how you view the world. So what you mentioned there, because I said sometimes it's very difficult to catch your thoughts, you can also look at your emotions and your behaviors first, and then trace it back to, okay, why am I doing this? So like earlier you mentioned with the guilt of taking breaks, right? You might not know why, right? So to draw the thought that kind of anchors your behavior is then asking, why do I feel so guilty? And processing those emotions to come to that conclusion of, oh, it's because I'm thinking this way. Then you ask another why. Why do I think this way? Maybe you grew up where it was instilled in you where you have to provide for your family, or maybe there is a fear of lack kind of environment that you grew up in. Yeah, so kudos to you. You can. I won't say you can be a psychologist, but you can practice. You can do therapy on yourself.
Endorsement right there. In case if I ever apply for a job, I've been endorsed by a qualified clinical psychologist. Do you think people can therapize? Because you just, what you did was you just constructed a framework and a step, right? So first, look at your behavior. Why are you acting a certain way? Why are you feeling that's causing you to act that way? And what is causing you to feel that way? And then find that thought and then just kind of break it down a little bit. It's almost like a foolproof methodology of self-therapy. So I'm just, that's my question. Is it possible to self-talk your way into health or self-talk your way into being resilient?
I would like to keep my job, so I would say
no.
Okay, I get these questions so often, okay? I get this question, should people go and see a psychologist if they don't have a mental health condition? It's a very hard question to answer, because like not everybody, I think the reality is not everybody might be able to afford it, and unfortunately, at least in our current landscape, right? And then we also ask, what would the utility of it be? Of course, having a third party, a neutral third party, can help point out these blind spots for you. While you can do it self-guided, right, you are only going to see this, you're definitely still going to have blind spots, right? That doesn't mean, because, so what I mentioned with cognitive behavioral therapy, there are a lot of CBT self-toolkits, like self-administered toolkits that you can guide yourself through it, right? But having that external, almost like a mirror reflecting to you and also then pointing out to you, hey, you might be missing this, and that, and have you thought about this, right? contrary to popular belief, no, psychologists, we cannot read your minds, right? Neither are many of us like super trained in like body language and things like that. We are trained to look out for signs and symptoms for sure. But a lot of what we're doing is we're throwing back the questions to you, rephrasing it so that it makes more sense to you to process it in a more palatable manner, right? So are you able to self-therapize yourself? To a certain degree, right? But of course, if some of the conditions that you are facing might be more, again, going back to the intensity, duration, and frequency thing, is something that you feel like you cannot manage, then please do seek professional help.
Yeah. The question is also centered around, are consultants helpful? Because people tend to make fun of consultants, right? First you con me, then you insult me, or that kind of thing, right? Consultants, in anything, right? Because there's this idea that what do consultants or therapists, counselors, it's just talking, right? But like you mentioned, though, they have specific skill sets, but they also are in a different context, which a lot of times is incredibly helpful. Just getting somebody else's perspective from a different context, because sometimes you can be so close to the problem or the situation or the issue that you just can't take a step back. Not that you don't want to, but you are literally unable to take a step back because you're just too close to it. I mean, I see this in business where people are just so caught up in the daily operations, day to day, that they just cannot pry themselves away to take a step back, to take stock of where are we, what are we doing, where are we going, and is what are we doing helping us to where we want to go. And I think similarly with our daily lives, we are caught in the hustle and bustle of life, both in career, business, but also navigating relationships. Because relationships, I think what not many people realize, is also work. It is also there's a mental load that comes along with it. And I find that, when you have somebody who is properly trained as a facilitator, that's able to ask you the right questions so that you can get that clarity, there's definitely value in that. So yes, full disclaimer, please, if you can, seek out a professional counselor, psychologist, because I think that is helpful.
Hi everyone, before we continue with our conversation, I want to take this moment to ask a favor from you. If you have been finding the content and direction of THX to be valuable, can you do me this one favor and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as the Spotify platform? This will give me an indication or an idea of how helpful or how valuable what we've been doing here at THX would be to you. And if you want to go even a step further, I want to invite you to subscribe to our Substack at thehumanexchange.substack.com. It's a mailing list, and the intention that I have behind that is to give you further insights to some of the topics that we've been talking about, as well as build a community that will be interested in exploring the themes of performance, purpose, as well as potential in both our professional and personal lives. Thanks everybody, and now back to the episode.
I do want to get your thoughts on trauma, because it's a big word that's thrown about a lot now. And it seems to be something that more and more people are using, right? So you've got two perspectives. You've got one perspective that is all about, yes, let's retrace by trauma, let's unpackage it and everything. But then you've got another perspective that goes like, well, you are. I forgot what's the word. They have a word that is a bit. It's not very kind, but it's trauma something. I don't know. But basically, you're kind of over glorifying it or giving it too much emphasis. So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how much of what we are going through or what we are unable to go through is due to our past experiences, or how much of it is that, hey, at the end of the day, you just gotta like suck it up and get on with it because life is tough. Are you going to rise to the challenge, or you're just going to fall back into whatever excuses that you have? So kind of two different perspectives, and how would you weigh in on that?
I think that it's a little bit tricky because on one hand, sure, you don't want people to trivialize the word trauma, right? But yet at the same time, sometimes it can be very difficult to place judgment on whether or not something is quote unquote traumatizing for a person, right? So of course, there are many different approaches to it, but I think ultimately, regardless of whether it's trauma or not, I think it's important to ask ourselves and whoever when we are processing in therapy, or ask yourselves, right? Like, what about it makes me deem it trauma? Okay, so clinically, trauma is something that will actually affect your safety, okay, or you have witnessed something that is life-threatening to a certain degree, or that that there is very significant damage. So for things like road traffic accidents, natural disasters, of course, a sexual assault and physical abuse. Now, of course, all these things, because it directly threatens your safety in one way or another, right? And because of that, there's also quite like a neurological impact in all of this, because you're in such high duress. Okay, now of course there is another thing where we call complex trauma, where it doesn't necessarily mean that you were in a life-threatening situation, but you were still under a lot of distress in one way or another. Maybe, we hear a lot of this narcissistic parenting, for example, or narcissistic relationships. Okay, so personally, I don't really challenge it when people say that, I was traumatized by so and so or whatever situation, but rather, okay, how do we deal with it then? Okay, so I'm personally, at least in my practice, I would accept whatever it is that you deem the trauma, right? But also then challenge you towards, okay, what can we do about it, right? So, back to what you mentioned earlier, should people come or not? Yes, come see a psychologist, see a counselor, but at the end of the day, I don't recommend staying in therapy forever. You should come, be empowered to know how to deal with whatever it is that you're facing, learn how to deal with it, move on with your life. And if you face another situation, which all of us would, and if you need to see a therapist again, then by all means, please do that, right? So regardless of whether you have trauma, what I think happens a lot in this day and age, it becomes you take on the identity of trauma, right? And then the perspective that you have of yourself then is, I am a victim of trauma. Right? So if you wear that identity, a lot of times unintentionally, right, you will react and respond in a way that you want to protect yourself. Because I have been traumatized, I have been victimized, right? So we have to reflect that, okay, if you're going to respond this way, what kind of consequence is it going to have? What kind of then reaction are you going to have from other people? And how does this cycle then perpetuate? Right, so reflecting this and opening it up, still processing that traumatizing thing or the trauma in your life, but not staying in that mindset.
It's almost like there's a degree to trauma, then, isn't there? Because like you mentioned, some very specific criteria, which I found very helpful. Like, one, was it life-threatening, or was it did it put you in any form of danger? So if you were to, some form of abuse, right? Your sense of safety was threatened, and you were in danger. Or if you witness somebody dying in front of you, that's kind of like, that's traumatic as well. That can be something that leaves a lasting impression. But then there are things like which may not have the same kind of severity, but it's still valid. Like, for example, if a parent says a mean thing to you, like, "Oh, you will never succeed," or you're so dumb, you're so stupid, that can be a form of trauma as well. But it's understanding the kind of degree it is, and knowing how severe it is, we're able then to take the necessary interventions or steps. So then it's almost like, I don't want to trivialize or simplify it. It's almost like, would you say that some things should be easier to get over rather than other? I know it's a dangerous question to ask, but it's almost like, hey, if you had a parent that was mean to you, right? They said something that caused you to lose confidence, versus you were in a situation where somebody actually threatened your safety or violated you. Those are two, from an objective point of view, very different things. So arguably, one should be harder or easier to get over than the other. I don't know. I know it's dangerous, but it is real world relevant, right? So let's go there.
Well, let me throw the question back to you. Which do you think it's easier to get over?
I feel like it's a trick question because from the surface, it seems like, well, the parent saying a loose word seems to be easier versus the other thing. I don't know. Am I right or wrong?
It's precisely because of this, I cannot give you a definite answer. But I would say there is no, I don't think I can quantify it that way. Again, because each individual's interpretation and how it gets encoded into their mind is very different, right? I'll give quite drastic examples. So I've had multiple patients, in fact, go through car accidents where even they lose family members. Okay, two similar cases. One actually was able to return to normal coping relatively quickly because this person's mentality was such that, I'm so thankful that at least I'm still alive, and my who, the other people in the car, we made it out, we were safe, right? But on this other hand, this other person thinks that my life is now just, how can I ever sit in a car again? I will never be able to travel, I will never be able to drive again, so on and so forth, right? Then what would you say? It's the same situation, right? Whereas a person who, let's say, a mean thing was said by a parent, one could argue also, because you're constantly exposed to that parent, the possibility of a repeat of that threat is constantly there, versus, let's say, maybe got caught in a fire. Super intense, right? But realistically, the possibility of you getting into a fire again versus this parent one, the chances of you hearing a nasty comment from your parent is higher than a person who get caught in a fire again. But if this fire person thinks, oh no, I'm going to get, every time I cook, right? I want to stop cooking already, right? So it really is a matter of how you process a lot of this information and the kind of thinking and framework you choose to view the world beyond that.
Yeah, it seems like there's so much more study and research that needs to go into this area, isn't it? Because while there are similarities, but they're not entirely 100% the same when it comes to physical and mental health, right? Because if you think about physical, there are some things that you can't come back from. Like, well, if you lose a limb, your limb's not going to grow back, right? But if you were to get a cut, or you can just you just take some time, it will grow, it will heal. If you break a leg, even, right? Yeah, you can come back from that. There are ways to kind of rehabilitate that. But it sounds like with mental issues and mental health, it's a lot less quantifiable, a lot less measurable. It really differs from individual to individual, and each individual are affected by a whole lot of nuanced factors that you and I, and maybe even the person themselves, may not be aware of.
Yep. Funny that you should bring up that, because I see a lot of amputee cases in the hospital, and I see a lot of chronic pain cases in the hospital as well, right? So the example that you give where somebody who has been amputated, well, of course, they will not regain back that limb, right? But it's still not an apples to apples comparison because of psychological impact there, right? Because for the person who might have lost a limb, they might view it as, oh, thankfully I didn't lose my life. right? And maybe I can go get a prosthesis or something and I can, as you say, go through some form of rehabilitation. But a person with chronic pain, for example, they might be holding on to this hope constantly that something will cure them. But as a result of them, they get very disappointed, very dejected, and their quality of life might be poorer than a person who had to undergo an amputation, right? So this is an example of how the physical and affecting the psychology of it all is so intertwined. And yeah, that's what makes it complex.
Comes back to what kind of expectations we're going to have and what are the lenses that we're putting on to view the world and our circumstance. Because the lens is, well, if you put on a pair of red shades, you will see everything with a tinge of red. If you put on blue shades, you will see everything with a tinge of blue. But it's, at least I experience it in my own life, it is actually a continuous, intentional effort to ensure that our lens is as clear as possible, that we see things from a healthy perspective. I'm not going to use the word good perspective because I don't believe in toxic positivity, right?
Same.
Where every pain has a purpose, every problem has a solution, every difficulty is an opportunity. No, I'm not about that, but I think it's about having a healthy perspective of what's happening, understanding the realities that you are in and the limitations that you may have. Then I would ask this question, what are some ways that a person can be, how can we lend support? Because I could ask this question, okay, what should I do to increase my mental resilience or wellness, right? But we might go there, but I'm interested to know what are some do's and don'ts when talking to somebody who is sharing that they have a mental health challenge and maybe they're even sharing some of their traumatic experiences. You don't want to run into a situation where maybe like me, you go, they just said that we'll just get over it, right? So I don't know. Any guides or pointers on that?
Yeah. Rule number 1, you don't understand them, right? It is something that we like to say is, I understand where you're coming from. I understand, right? I think it's okay to say I understand where you're coming from, but the reality is, no, you can never fully understand what another person is going through.
And we shouldn't pretend to.
Correct. Absolutely right. So, one amputee, right, to another amputee, they're both amputees, but their experience will be completely different, right? Of course, you can come together and bring the shared experiences and the commonalities and process them in support together, right? And that's one way to do it. But so don't say that you understand, right? You can just say things like, I'm here, I want to hear where you're coming from, okay? Secondly is, I think a lot of people are very worried that they will be a burden to others whenever they reveal certain information, right? I hear this so often, like, I can't share this with my friends. Because, they have their own problems to deal with, right? And bearing in mind, I don't think everybody is suited to take on their friends' issues. You might have enough going on for yourself, right? So I think if you are ready, right, just giving that friend or that person the reassurance, hey, I'm not sure how you're doing, but I can tell them maybe something's not really, you're going through a tough time. I'm really open to listening to you, and I'm here to support you if you need me, right? So actually offering that space is important. Okay, so don't pretend to understand everything. Second, reassuring that person that you are open to hear. Third, ask, right? Because everybody will want to be supported in a different way. Now, not everyone knows how to articulate what kind of help that they need. And I think you shouldn't put pressure on the person. Hey, why don't you tell me? Right? You can always say something like, hey, I'm here to support you, but I might not know how. If you do have a way that you prefer for me to support you, just feel free to let me know. Yeah, because for some of them, it could be, you might have to give certain examples. Would you like for me to just sit with you? Would you like to talk about it? Or would you like for me to maybe send you a text later in the week? Yeah, so if they can't articulate what, maybe giving them some options and then leaving the fourth option, or you tell me what works best for you.
Let me then, those are very insightful, thank you. Let me switch gears a little bit or ramp it up a little bit. What if I am a team leader or a manager and I have somebody that I'm leading or managing and they are not being productive at work, maybe even being absent sometimes, and they use this as a reason, or I've got this mental health challenges, I've got this trauma I'm dealing with, but at the same time you still need to kind of like get the person to deliver, right? Because there are things that needs to be achieved. Do you have any kind of like a further advice you can give to somebody in that kind of context?
I can't say I'm an expert in this area because maybe that bleeds out a little bit into more of like human resource management and taking into account organizational needs, right? But from a human to human perspective, I think a lot of times employees who then become my clients or my patients will say like, it's not safe to share, right? Because it will have repercussions on me. I think it's inevitable because if really your performance is going to be affected, you will not feel safe disclosing this information, because what if I disclose and it then be used against me, right? So I think going back to the reassurance, but be realistic about what you can reassure them of. So don't make empty promises like, oh, don't worry, I won't tell anybody about this, or like, upper management or anything, but offer what you can. Like, okay, if this is going on and you're really struggling, whether some sort of alternative work arrangement can be made, right? Or again, what is it that this person needs? At least try to get a better understanding, right? But of course, because I'm sure this manager will also have to report to a larger organization, I think there are systemic issues of course, where maybe it's not very safe, or you as the manager are not able to offer, let's say, a more flexible working arrangement, then something has to be done to close that gap there. Yeah, but again, reassuring this person why you are even asking and what is it that you hope to achieve by asking, whether it's just to better understand their position or whether or not something can be worked out. But I would say majority of my patients who struggle at work or struggle at something in their personal lives and affecting their work is usually because they don't feel safe asking for or telling anyone at work.
And I think managers can also apply that 3 steps that you suggested. Like, one is don't assume, right? Don't assume, because I think we sometimes think that we understand, but like you mentioned, you may not fully know the impact or the impact that whatever that this person is going through is affecting them. Now, you may think that if this affects me, it will be not a big deal, but to them it could be. I think that's one thing. Secondly, then you talk about assessing whether you have the capacity to support this person. So it's again then looking at the kind of what kind of work is this team member doing? Is this workload able to be picked up by somebody else in the team, or maybe you pick it up for a while? And then, of course, asking them what kind of support do they need. Maybe they need flexible work arrangements, or maybe they need some time off, and then you will have to decide in your context whether this is something that you can provide, whether you even have the decision-making power to give them those things, or whether you have the capacity to take on their load. But I think very, very helpful, start by not assuming and just communicating. I think often a lot of managers, they make it unsafe, not intentionally, but they perhaps forget this human element in human resource management, HR, right? Because human resource, there is the resource part, but there's also human part. You're still managing human beings. It's not like a robot or a computer where you put in the right formula or put in the right prompt and you'll generate the right result. No, it's a mental load as well, managing and leading. I think that's something that not many people realize. They think that being a manager means I tell other people what to do. Yes, you get the privilege, but you also bear the mental load of, taking care of them, not just from a professional standpoint. You have to take into account what's happening with them personally if the need arises. I've been enjoying this conversation, very insightful, very rich. Before we kind of end, is there anything you want to add or that you want to speak into in terms of this area of mental health, mental well-being, disorders? Yeah, anything that you want to share?
I think ultimately, life can be really tough, right? But I think that it is important to pause and look at the little things that make life worth living, right? And at the end of the day, at the moment in time with whatever you're struggling with, that is that moment in time. There's still so many other moments ahead of you that is still left to be defined, right? So while it's challenging, right, individually, what more working with other people together, right? I think I have seen time and time again that it is possible to find a way out, regardless of the situation, right? It doesn't mean that everything will be solved, but there is somewhat of a way out. Yeah, so do with that what you would.
Reminds me of a quote from a movie I watched yesterday. Totally different context, but still applicable. It goes something like, it matters less of how we got here. What matters more is what we do from here. So, all of us reach this point of our lives, going through various different things. Maybe we went through some trauma, maybe we went through some challenges, ups and downs. But the important thing now, as you mentioned, is, you're here now. And if you have the capacity, you have the ability, change, you can start changing or affecting from now. Whether it's expanding more or learning to pull back, like in my case, recognizing my limits and my own capacity and coming into acceptance, not as a form of giving up, but as a form of I suppose, it's a form of maturity and wisdom, knowing that, you don't have to push so hard and not that there's no work to be done, but you can work differently. It's not about working less, but it's about working differently. And I think it's the same when we're managing our own mental load, finding ways to get meaningful rest, recharging, so that we can build for the long run. I think that's the key, right? We want to build, or we want to live life in full, with a long runway ahead of us to enjoy and to achieve all that life has for us.
Yep, you summarized it perfectly.
Well, I do this for every guest. I will ask them. I already kind of know your answer, but is there anywhere people can reach you? If are you active on any socials? No, right? So if they want to find out more about you, do I just put the hospital website, or you're like, no?
I mean, you can reach me on LinkedIn. I check it sporadically.
Like every 6 months? Every 6 years?
Whenever someone sends me a connection request, I do respond to them. Yeah, actually, probably reaching me through LinkedIn is the best. Yeah, I never update my profile, but I respond to the messages. Maybe I should do that.
So if your recent job description says you're like a assistant in some grocery somewhere, they should not be alarmed, right?
Yes,
that's not updated. Okay, gotcha. Well, Em, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in to this episode of THX. If you found this helpful, invite you to like and subscribe and check out the rest of the other episodes that has been uploaded. I'm John. Thank you so much for tuning in again, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.